up, everybody? Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. I'm your host, Ricky Ferrandis. Today we have a very interesting and exciting show for you. It's a show that I've been meaning to do for a long time, but I haven't found the right guest. And today I have Kent Masterson Brown, who is an attorney. He's a Kentucky native. He's a historian and founder of Witnessing History, which is a film and media company. And I ran into his documentary called Bourbon in Kentucky, A History Distilled on Amazon Prime. So if you have Amazon Prime, you can watch it for free. If you don't have Amazon Prime, I don't know what the cost is, but for very little money, you could rent it and watch it. But it is a documentary that brings together two subjects I absolutely love, bourbon and whiskey, and a lot of things that you see on labels like straight whiskey and straight bourbon or bonded bourbon, all these things and names of bourbon companies like Woodford Reserve or Elijah Craig or all these companies, Evan Williams. You see the history of these families that created these companies and where these names came from and where the word bourbon came from. So it's really interesting. It was a great and fun conversation we had. We talked about this film, Bourbon and Kentucky, A History Distilled. And we also talked about a little bit about some of his other work that seems really interesting that I'm going to have to dibble dabble in and check out also. And hopefully I'll have him on again to talk about history, because he's just a ball of knowledge and really enjoy talking to him. But I won't hold you guys up too much. Enjoy this podcast. If you like podcasts like this, check out my other one I did with Delisa, the Cigar Vixen, on cigars. And whiskey and cigars, for me, they go hand in hand, and wine and these simple things of enjoying taste and smells and just the senses that we neglect so much of the day and so much of our lives, because we're constantly looking at digital entertainment and text messaging and emails or whatnot. So I really think that there's something that we love and we're trying to hold on to with bourbon and whiskeys and cigars, and I think we're trying to hold on to what it does. It brings us together. It gives us a moment to reflect and kind of think about what we're doing, or even if it's just thinking about nothing and just a different type of meditation. And but either way, I think that there is benefits to having these social events of hanging out with your friends and having drinks. And I know alcohol has caused some negative things in history, and we briefly talked about prohibition on this show. And at that time, much of America did have a drinking problem. But I think done, I shouldn't say correctly, but done responsibly, it can be a very positive part of your life. I've had some of my best conversations with friends during alcohol. I remember when I was doing a lot of dating, alcohol always took away the tenseness and the anxiety of hanging out and meeting somebody new, and you really got to open up and enjoy yourself. So I think it does bring some positive. And just like any tool, a rifle can be used to kill food to eat, or it can be used to harm somebody. I think alcohol is the same thing. We have to look at it as it's not alcohol causing any horror or violence or these things. It's humans not using it wisely and using it in a positive manner. So everything in moderation, even moderation. And so I'll get right into it. Of course, if you want to support the show, I did start a Patreon page, so feel free to check that out. Anybody who can afford to give a little bit, then great. It'll keep this project going. If you can't, then don't worry about it. Just I probably shouldn't be telling this, but I'm going to continue doing this podcast as long as I can anyways. And also in the show notes on our YouTube channel, you can just look up the Ripple Effect Podcast, and in our show notes, I'll have links to Kent's website and the documentary, and hopefully his books. I'll look for him on Amazon or on his website and put links to that, and we'll do all that. So thanks again, guys. Really appreciate it. I have CJ Hunt from The Perfect Human Diet coming on later this week, so look out for that podcast. And if you like this episode or you like this podcast in general, please rate the show, tweet it, share it, post it. And it's all open source, so feel free to upload it anywhere you want. And just trying to spread the information, trying to start our own little ripple on this little show we call the Ripple Effect Podcast. So thanks again, guys, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace. Good. Thanks for being with me today.
Well, sure.
And well, I guess we might as well get started. But
yeah,
I'm a huge fan of your documentary. It was
really,
yeah. Well, it was I've been looking for a mixture of history and something on bourbon and whiskeys and stuff like that. And one thing I really liked about your documentary that it took two subjects I loved was the history aspect of it and the bourbon aspect of it. And
yeah, we're doing one. We're right now raising the capital to do a similar one on the story of hemp in Kentucky. Kentucky was the largest producer of hemp in the 19th century of any place on earth, next to Russia.
Oh, wow.
And they used the hemp for bagging, floor coverings, clothing. But they also, Kentucky became the sole supplier of hemp to the United States Navy in the War of 1812 because the Russian water-rotted hemp they couldn't get because of Russia's war with Napoleon. So Kentucky became the default provider of roping and sails to the United States Navy. So, I mean, it has a remarkable history here, and but it's starting to come back. We have a kind of a protected and guarded hemp industry going on right now, and so we're going to do another one on that, which is kind of fun.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of people don't realize how significant things like hemp and whiskey was in the history of America.
Right. And it's we just think it's just a social drink, but it's not. It was not to them. This was. It was far more vital and needed than one would think.
Yeah, well, hemp, I mean, a lot of people don't realize that, Henry Ford's fenders were made out of hemp and
absolutely.
First American flag, I believe, was made out of hemp.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
So
and, here in these frontier stations during the Revolution, like the Siege of Bryan Station, which is just east of where I'm sitting in this county. The combined tribes, some 800 of them from the Great Lakes, along with Butler's Rangers out of New York, besieged it in August of 1782. And Simon Girty was present with this mob. And, of course, he was the most notorious character on the frontier. And there's a record of him. The Indians are all concealed, and the provincial rangers are concealed. And they're concealed in a hemp field, which surrounded this fort. They were all growing hemp because they used it for their clothes. And Girty actually comes out of the hemp field, shows himself, and demands the garrison surrender. And I know it's just given a whole new look to this story that on one side of the fort were cornfields, which were also essential for a whole wide range of reasons, including distilling. But on the other were all hemp. And, of course, hemp fields are really thick and dense. And here he comes out of this hemp field and lets everybody know that they are entirely surrounded. They're all concealed in this hemp field, and gives us an entirely different light to what the frontier was and what it was like. Yeah, it's really cool.
Do you think, because it is funny how both of them have a history, that they're both deep-rooted in our history, but yet it seems like alcohol has always been more socially acceptable, it's almost like we don't put it in the same category of other things, because even though I'm an alcohol drinker, I love my bourbon and my whiskeys, I also understand that it's been kind of unfair the way that marijuana's been treated, or hemp, which hemp even worse because it's not really a drug. It doesn't get you high, so
although some of the great writers in Kentucky in the late 19th century. James Lane Allen principally wrote novels, mostly kind of lost cause novels. But they were all about Kentucky, and one of them was a tale from the hemp fields. It's a marvelous story, and it has terrific descriptions of what it was like in central Kentucky in the years right before and during and then particularly after the Civil War. But he refers to the hemp fields as having a, quote, narcotic effect, end quote. And hemp fields have an aroma, just like tobacco fields do. And tobacco has a lovely aroma, really, particularly when it's drying. I used to love to smell tobacco around here. Hemp, though, is something we've lost track of what those fields were like. And during the harvesting of it, there's a real aroma that comes out of them. And Allen is in part referring to that, but also referring to the fact that there are other properties of it. And that, of course, is the reason the federal government has clamped down on it over the years, and fear that, people will be growing this and marijuana in the middle of it and all this. I've never sampled any of that stuff in my life, don't care to. But apparently this first cousin to marijuana does have some properties to it that can, as Allen says, that have kind of a narcotic effect. But in reality, it is a very useful plant.
Yeah. No, I
extraordinarily useful one, even for making drugs, ointments. The seed and the oil from it is extraordinarily valuable. And in fact, the seed has been among the most lucrative of all plants properties anywhere, is the hemp seed. But I mean, the fiber, you can do a lot with a hemp plant. You really can.
Yeah, it is a magical plant. I don't smoke marijuana myself, but I definitely see the unfair treatment of it. And I have 2 kids, and when you hear stories about children who can't get medical marijuana and could really improve their wellness and quality of life, but because of these archaic laws, they can't get marijuana to help their children. It just, it kind of seems, and being, I'm Portuguese, so I was born in Western Europe, and alcohol is a part of our history. Alcohol is a part of our culture. I mean, I've always been exposed to it when I was a kid. Typical European father, like, hey, you want to try this? You want to sip this? And
that was the household I grew up into, and it's the household I have now. I have my 2 old fashions every evening.
Yeah. If this podcast was any later in the day, I'd start drinking bourbon with you while we're talking about it. But
some people have said that the film Bourbon in Kentucky says one thing I like about it, Ken, is it makes you want to drink.
It's so true. Last night I started rewatching it, and same thing. I can't help but want to drink bourbon the second I start watching it. It's just the history of it's so interesting. But
well, it is, and growing up here in Kentucky. It's just permeates the place. It's like, you grew up here in the 1950s, and you got healthy doses of whiskey and tobacco, whether you intended to or not.
Yeah.
Because that's what the culture was,
Are you a cigar smoker also?
No, I don't smoke at all. But it was just you'd get a healthy dose of it just smelling this place.
Oh, I'm sure.
Because in the fall, when they bring all the tobacco into Lexington for the auctions, the sales, this place smelled of dried tobacco so much you could cut it with a knife. And I remember as a kid sitting up in the stands at a University of Kentucky football games in particularly November or late October, when all those warehouses were loaded with all this tobacco. And then R.J. Reynolds had a redrying facility not too far from the university. And honestly, the aroma of that, I mean, it just covered the stadium. It's just everywhere. And it was kind of neat. Every late fall, the town would just become completely immersed in this wonderful aroma of dried tobacco.
Yeah.
I miss it. I miss it much because it was a lovely kind of thing.
Well, I think a lot of, I'm 32, and I think I'm seeing a lot more people my age or younger or a little older getting into bourbons and cigars again. And I think that it's something like we're getting so detached from our senses, the enjoyment of just smells and tastes. And,
exactly.
That I think that people are actually looking to hold on to that. I think, when you look at an iPhone and you look at a tablet or you're playing video games, you're constantly getting stimulated and there's so much going on. And then there's something about just sitting down and relaxing. That's why I got into, whiskeys, I got into cigars, I got into wine. A lot of it was just the giving me a reason, an opportunity to sit down, kind of reflect, think, and the conversations you would get into with friends when you're doing those specific things, sitting around and trying, I would have like a cigar and whiskey night where I'd have buddies come over and everybody would bring, a whiskey they liked and we would taste it and then talk about it and hang out, and everybody's phone was aside. And it was just, even if you weren't a huge whiskey fan, people would come to my house just to hang out because they knew that it'd be fun to just to sit down and talk. And
it is wonderful. It does facilitate that. It really does. And it's why I enjoy it every evening. I look forward to it. And I never go beyond 2. But I sit down and talk with the family, the kids, and I have my old fashioned.
It's funny because I'm sure some people listening to this saying that you don't ever go past 2 and you drink every day. They, to some people that might seem a little weird or might seem a little excessive, but to me that's the way my father lived his whole life. And
same with mine.
Yeah, he's still till this day, doesn't have lunch, doesn't eat without wine, doesn't, if I eat at my parents' place, right after the wine, then it's like, we have espresso and we have some after dinner drink, or we have, or I've gotten actually more and more, I've gotten my father into bourbons, and it's not, bourbon's obviously not a huge part of the Portuguese culture, but he's slowly starting to appreciate it and like it. And so, we'll have a little whiskey after dinner, and it just, it brings the family together. You talk, you hang out, and it gives you a reason to sit down and actually enjoy each other's company. And absolutely. I think the further we get away from these simple pleasures in life, the more we realize, oh crap, we're getting further and further from this. We actually want to hold on to some of this. And
yeah, it's very civilizing. I mean, it's one of those things that can be uncivilizing too if you don't watch it. But
of course, yeah.
But the point is that within the bounds of reason, it is as civilizing a thing as you can find.
Yeah, and I think doing something like yourself, like you were talking about in your household, alcohol is not looked at as this scary, demonizing thing that a lot of households do end up doing. They create this thing where their children are afraid of alcohol because their parents, plant this seed of fear. And I'll tell you, I have friends and family members, or not family members, but friends and their family members that have grown up in houses like that where alcohol where alcohol was the path to hell. It was Satan's spirits and all this stuff. And what ends up happening is that the second a kid gets the opportunity to try it, I've had a close friend of mine say that the second they tried alcohol and realized that it wasn't as bad as their parents told them, they've almost lost all trust in their parents. Like, oh, you told me this was so harmful and it was going to ruin my life if I had some, and I realized that I can actually enjoy it and be a social drinker, and it actually brings some pleasure to my life. And that they almost lost, it almost makes them want to try all the things their parents told them not to do, So, you got to be careful about all the don't do's. Yes,
now,
I
for sure.
Agree.
My first child was born when I was 50, and she's heading to college this year. But I've always tried to avoid, except things, of course, that are obviously ones you don't want them to deal with. Most of this are things that, I just like to enjoy around them. Whether they want to do that ever or not, I don't know. It's totally up to them. But I do want to know it can be enjoyed within the bounds of reason. And that's the important thing. And not to be afraid of it, not to be look askance at it. But, it can be enjoyed, and you can be reasonable with it. And I don't think any one of them will ever want to do it personally. But if they do, they'll know it's nothing they should be ashamed of.
Well, I think like the method that you're using, and just kind of looking at it as anything else, and be like, hey, it's something that if you're responsible enough to use it, and you use it in the right way, then it can be an enjoyable part of your day, an enjoyable part of your life, and it can also bring friendships together. People open up while they drink. All of these positive things to it, and
right.
I think it takes away the sexiness of it. I remember growing up, and because I was always exposed to alcohol at home, and there was no liquor cabinet that was locked or anything like that. That when I went out with my friends who did grow up in households like that, where alcohol was this bad thing, they were just dying to try it and drink it and drink more of it. Where I was, I always looked at it as, it's just alcohol. What's the big deal? What are you guys so excited about?
Big deal.
Yeah, and
I've been raised with that all my life.
Yeah,
I have a great story. My mother and father came to Kentucky in the 1940s, and I was born here, but they all came from New York City, and my family goes back into New York City all the way to 1638. I'm the first one of the family born outside of that city.
Oh, wow.
Since then. And one of the members of our family we brought down from New York in the 1950s was my great aunt, who was born in 1879 in New York. And her father ran Tiffany's when it was on Union Square. And she saw Grant's funeral from the window at Tiffany's, and I mean, she had a great story. But she loved to tell about her father, who liked his rye, which of course was the drink of choice in New York City. And she said, oh, he would never touch a bourbon. But my great aunt coming down here loved bourbon, and she would have her 2 old fashions every night. And I'll never forget, on her 98th birthday, we took her out to lunch, and she ordered 2 old fashions, and then the waitress came by. She said, well, now, shall I get your dinner order, or would you like something else? She says, and my aunt goes, now, I'd like another old fashioned. This would be the 3rd. And my mother turned to her and just, out loud said, now, Nana, for heaven's sakes, you've already had 2. And this 98-year-old, they referred to her as the Duchess. She had this wonderful persona. She turned to my mother and goes, Dottie, butt out. She was going to have that old-fashioned one more.
It is funny how I almost feel like it's counterproductive looking at alcohol in a manner that it is, when you only look at the negative aspects of it.
Yeah.
I think it becomes counterproductive. I have a friend of mine who's a police officer, and he talks about how once a drug gets on the news and talks about how dangerous it is, the sales of it go up. It's like kids want to do it because of the fact that, it's like, oh, if this is so dangerous, what's all the hype about? So it's like it is counterproductive. Where when you go to European countries, they don't, alcohol is just a part of their culture. It's not a big deal, and because of it, I almost feel like it takes away the sexiness. Kids automatically want to do things that you tell them not to do. If I tell somebody, a child, hey, don't touch this envelope in this room, when I leave that room, he's going to be staring at that envelope, wondering what's in it, and possibly open it. But if I never talk about it, then it's not a big deal. So
that's right.
Yeah,
that's right. That's right. That's right.
So I'm
really glad you liked the film. That film has been broadcast right now, we almost every public station or public network in America, as well as in Canada, and it is being broadcast by the History Channel in Australia and New Zealand.
Awesome.
And we, and of course, YouTube and everything else, it is just gone everywhere, and beyond my wildest dreams, frankly, for that film.
Yeah, I saw
in terms of just exposure.
I saw it on Amazon Prime, and it got my attention because, again, like I said, I'm a huge history fan. I've had tons of historians on the show, and I've done a whole show on cigars and the history of cigars and stuff like that. But I'm like, I really want to do one on bourbon and whiskey, but I haven't found the right person. It was I liked the idea of combining the history of it. It wasn't just talking about bourbon as in, okay, what makes bourbon, you know, how is it made, but the history of it and how the one thing I loved too was the names of the bourbons, how much of it was a history story within itself, just like
within itself. Yeah. Every one of them have something on their label that tries to identify with that period of Kentucky's story. The earliest settlers and ancient age. You know, the ancient age they're talking about is the frontier. Because that's what the label says.
Yeah. And, you know, and Elijah Craig, like the fact that these are real people.
They're real people.
Who have, you know, their hand in the history of Kentucky and bourbon, and Evan Williams and all this stuff. So it's really interesting. So people who are listening, I might have some listeners who probably don't even know what bourbon is, haven't watched the documentary yet. So what is the difference between a bourbon and a typical whiskey? What makes it unique for somebody who's listening?
Well, it is the and every bourbon now is different, and it depends upon the master distiller's recipe. Every one of them have a different recipe for it. But generally speaking, bourbon is composed of at least 80% corn. And, of course, there's a story about the corn, because this is what created the distilling industry, was the Virginia legislature during the Revolution enacted a provision that settlers could claim as much land as they could grow corn on it, trying to encourage the settlement of Kentucky. And so many of these settlers came out here and just planted enormous acreages of corn, and naturally you can't, once that corn is taken off the stem in the fall, you got to do something with it. It'll rot otherwise. And so that was one of the principal reasons why they would distill. They would distill it because they used it for all kinds of purposes, but they also found they could trade it. It had a value, and each distiller had his own mechanism for distilling, his own mix. You put 80% corn, but then some distillers add a rye to it. Some add some barley to it. Some add other grains, and then they create what's called a sour mash. And it's that sour mash that is boiled, put together, and then it is put into pot stills, and it is then distilled down so that the steam going through the circular tubes outside the pot still capture the steam, turn it to liquid, and out comes the alcohol. But every one of these distillers had their own distinctive recipe, and but the bulk of what it is a corn whiskey, because that's how it started here. And so the difference between bourbon and all other whiskeys too is where it comes from. Kentucky was fortunate. The settlers here, they recognized a great place when they saw it. Kentucky not only has very fertile soil, but the soil rests on an enormous bed of limestone. And I mean, this limestone's 400 million years old, and limestone's very porous. And so we get rains, and it seeps through the soil to the limestone bed, and that water will then seep through the limestone into literally rivers and rivulets that run underground and they come out of the surface as springs, sinking springs all over the place here. And it's that water that they found to be, because of the limestone in it, they found that made the best distilling water there was. And so even today in the federal regulations, to be called a bourbon whiskey, it has to be distilled in Kentucky. It has to be aged in Kentucky at least 1 year. So it is a distinctive product of this state. And because of, one, the corn, which is historic, and number two, the limestone water that is used to make it.
You said 80% corn. That's maximum 80% corn, right? Minimum.
Maximum, yes, yeah. Max.
So
max.
Minimum 50. All.
Yeah. Each distiller is going to have his own recipe for that. Some much less, but they add other grains, and but the big grain factor in it is corn.
Yeah. So corn's what makes it, because minimum is 51. So all bourbon's minimum 51% corn.
Minimum 51, right?
And then like you said, then the rest of it is their own formula.
Their own formula. Yeah.
Which you said in the documentary that really some of them are family secrets, right? And some of them have actually changed in time, right? Because
they absolutely are. I love the illustration of Sarah Carpenter's sour mash recipe at Carpenter Station. I mean, she wrote that in like 1782, and you could see they were developing their own sour mashes then, and by putting down recipes for them.
Yeah, and so whiskey today, because sometimes I've talked to people about wine, and people will talk about seeing this bottle from 1920, and I always wonder, I'm like, what do they like their wine to taste like then compared to today? And if we would like a bottle that old, if what we think of wine today is still what they thought of wine then. Same thing with whiskeys. Whiskey was much harsher, no, back then, and then as time went by, did it get smoother, or is it basically very similar in taste?
Well, it's probably very similar in taste. Where you get a lot of difference is the how long it's aged. I remember doing the research on that film, and I was going through the Kentucky Gazette, which was the first newspaper ever published in Kentucky, and it was published here in Lexington. And it was advertising in there for 17-year-old whiskey, if you can imagine. Now, there comes a point, so distillers tell me that you start losing flavor when it gets too old. However, they were the big draw in the early frontier, as it is now, is the length of time it has aged. And they promote that on the label, just like they did then. And you get bourbons that are 8 and 9 years old, and you have a very different flavor for that bourbon than ones that are 2 and 3.
Yeah.
They get smoother.
Yeah, well, it's same thing with scotches and a lot of other different drinks. The only thing is, it's funny because when you read reviews on whiskeys and bourbons and scotches, a lot of times I remember just looking up, like, just trying to get some recommendations on maybe some bourbons to try. So I'd read, what are these guys considered a top 10 bourbons or whatnot, and I would look it up, and sometimes if a bourbon's too smooth, the reviewer didn't like that. It was
Yep.
like you said, there was a lack of taste. It's almost like a little bit of a bite was a part of the
part of the deal.
Yeah, part of the deal.
Yeah, it's part of the deal. As I say, some of these whiskeys they start losing their distinctive flavor and kind of punch when they get too old. So again, part of the distiller, it comes to, after experience, using his own recipe, he comes to how long he thinks it should be aged, and so that it has a flavor that he likes. And it all varies.
Yeah, and that's interesting, because you look at, like, for example, the really I guess exclusive Poppy Van Winkles now. The Poppy Van Winkle 20-year-old and 23-year-old, and actually I've been invited recently to a Poppy Van Winkle tasting, and my buddy actually has a couple bottles. He bought them before it really got popular. And it makes you wonder, like, the 20-year-old stuff and the 23-year-old stuff, the most expensive of bourbons, might not be the best of because
no, you're right. You're
Yeah.
right. You're right. That's right.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Yeah, it's funny because the unique thing about whiskey compared to, like, vodkas and other spirits is, I tell my friends, I'm like, we consider the best vodkas the one that has the littlest of taste. It's like this.
Yeah, well, exactly.
Yeah, that's smoother.
I don't like vodka or gin much. I don't. I just like the bourbon, frankly.
Yeah, but it's a different type of a person who gets into it, because it's like, if you say, hey, this is a really good vodka, what you're really saying is there's minimal taste, where a good whiskey is the opposite. You're actually looking for flavors and looking for taste. So it is a completely different experience. And and the corn thing's really interesting, because, like you were saying, like, the history of the fact that they had all this extra corn, and they're like, well, what are we going to do with it? We might as well make some spirits. And then that goes into the history of how New Orleans became big in a bourbon. And I've never been Kentucky, but last year was my first time I've been in New Orleans, and went to,
I love New Orleans.
yeah, same here. And I went to Bourbon Street. I'm gonna have to look again next if I ever go there again, because I was hoping to have, like, tons of bourbon bars, but it really there wasn't that much of that.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up. One thing that fascinated me about the story is really how bourbon got its name. Speaking of Bourbon Street, we have a county just contiguous to my home county here, Fayette, which was named for Lafayette. We were settled by Revolutionary War pensioners, as you can tell, and they all wanted to name places after their experience. And so I live in Fayette County, named for the Marquis de Lafayette, and the county just to the northeast of us is Bourbon County, and its county seat is Paris. And some people like to say, and it's even in the film, that Jacob Spears, who lived there, he settled there after leaving Harrodsburg, and was, so some people say, one of Kentucky's first distillers. But I'm very familiar with Bourbon County, and in fact, I'm very familiar with the Spears family. They're all still there, all the direct descendants of Jacob Spears and Abraham Spears and Noah Spears. They're all in that film. But I turned to Dottie Spears, and the wife of Bill Spears, who they were great friends, and they provided some information for me at the beginning of the film. And I asked her, I said, Dottie, why don't you go to the newspaper office and get into the microfilms of the Western Citizen newspaper? And what I want you to do is begin at the beginning that they have, and I think it's like 1790 something. And I said, roll through there and look at all the commission merchants' advertising. from commission merchants in particularly Maysville, which is a town on the Ohio River north of Paris. And I want you to see if you can tell when you see them advertising only for bourbon. Up to where I'm finding everything right now is the merchants are advertising for 3, 5, 7, 10-year-old whiskey from Bourbon County or Bourbon County whiskey. Now, I want you to see when you can, if you can, find in that newspaper, which is an old paper published in Paris, when they changed it to just bourbon, if they did during the time in which that newspaper was run. Well, weeks passed, and Dottie called me up and said to me, Kent, I've got to show you something. So I got in the car and drove over to Paris and sat down with her, and she showed me, she printed out copies of various pages of these. She said, look, here it is in 1810. It's whiskey from Bourbon County whiskey from Bourbon County. She kept going through this, and there's more and more and more. And by the way, Bourbon County then, as the film says, I mean, that's something like what are now 38 counties in northeastern Kentucky composed Bourbon County after 1786. It's just an enormous piece of what is now Kentucky. Was once Bourbon County. And we kept going through this stuff, and she says, now look at this. And here's a July 1821 edition of the Western Citizen. And she says, look at that. And the merchants were advertising bourbon. They had winnowed it down, so like we all do, to one word, because if you could say that word, everybody would know what it is. So it gets its name from the county that once was enormous and now is much smaller. It's only it's a smaller county, but a beautiful county. And it had just winnowed its way down over the decades to just bourbon. And what was fascinating about it is that these early settlers, this is also in the film, even at Boonesboro, we found a ledger book from Boonesboro, which was, of course, the settlement of Daniel Boone. And this settlement in the late 1780s was shipping its whiskey to New Orleans. They had found New Orleans to be a market for whiskey in Kentucky, I mean, in the 1780s. And so as time went by and they winnowed it down to bourbon, that great market in New Orleans rather liked that. I mean, see, they're French, mostly, and some Spanish, but mostly French. And so this Bourbon County got its name from the Royal House of France, the Bourbons. And this liquor is now, the name has just winnowed itself down to just bourbon, and everybody in New Orleans knew exactly what that was. You realize in 1819, Kentucky was exporting to New Orleans alone 200,000 gallons of whiskey a month.
Wow.
That's how big it was. And, you know, one in every 5 farmers was a distiller.
That's insane. Yeah. That's...
It's totally insane. And you kind of go, well, who's drinking it all down there? Well, they're selling it all over the world.
Yeah. That's so awesome. I mean, and Prohibition took before I get into Prohibition, because I'm sure that took a huge hit in the Kentucky industry. And actually,
it did, yeah.
You know, I've heard stories of people who worked in distilleries in the 80s and 90s who were getting laid off and you know, get laid off for some time, and now it's booming, and you know,
booming.
Yeah,
it's a booming business. Yeah.
So it's definitely picked up quite a bit. But how did Prohibition affect the bourbon industry in Kentucky?
It virtually shut it down. I mean, just like at the same time, I mean, or just shortly thereafter, they were clamping down on hemp. I mean, I have a dear friend just north of where I'm seated, who still lives on an enormous acreage of land. They were Revolutionary War pensioners, his ancestors, but they were immense hemp farmers. And I mean, he even talks about having German prisoners of war out there in the fields as a kid, harvesting the hemp. But he also recalls when the feds came by and seized his entire barn filled with hemp seed. They just seized it, locked it up, and took it.
Wow.
This is 1937. And so, yeah, where you've got Prohibition, there's no market, no access to sale, and it put a huge crimp. Thank goodness for the industry. It didn't last long, but
well, in Tennessee, they talk about how Jack Daniels, in the distillery that Jack Daniels has made in Tennessee, you actually can't drink it because it's a dry county or dry town or something like that.
Yeah.
So that's
Bourbon County was dry up until just recently.
Really?
It shows you all the reformers got hold of it back in the 19th century, late 19th century. But now, I mean, the Spearses are even in the process of assisting in putting together an entirely new distillery in Bourbon County. So they're back in the business. It is a booming thing. One of my close friends here in Lexington is Tom Bullitt, who, of course, is the distiller of Bullitt Bourbon.
Yeah.
And the fellow that helped him get that onto the national scene is going to be with me on this weekend. But there's an example of a guy who he and I were law partners, and he just left practicing law and said, "I'm going to go and distill." And I said, "Well, I'm glad you got the wherewithal to do it."
Yeah.
And he just left and started, running his own recipe through the Four Roses distillery. They would distill for him, and he created this Bullitt bourbon, which has been quite a sensation. I mean, and notice he calls it frontier whiskey.
Yeah. It's Bullitt's. It's funny because Bullitt's one of those ones that it's not that. That's the thing about what I love about bourbon is you can get a really good bourbon really inexpensively. Where to get a really good Scotch or something else, you're paying top dollar. But you can get, you look at Bullitt, you look at Woodford Reserve, you look at so many good bourbons that you can get that aren't really that expensive. Where you could drink every, have a little bit of it every day and not go broke. And and so it's really interesting. Even what was it, 1792 and all these really inexpensive bourbons that you can get that are delicious and it's just it's amazing because I think that's one of the reasons I loved bourbon so much was that people would bring over a bourbon that I'd fall in love with. I'm like, wow, this is really good, and I'm like, I'm gonna have to go buy a bottle of this. I'd go and then I look at the price. I'm like, really? That's it? It's just you're really surprised you can get a really good bourbon for.
I drove by the 1792 distillery yesterday. I was down in south central Kentucky and came back through Bardstown, which of course is one of the bourbon capitals of America, of the world. And the road I was coming in on to get into Bardstown went right through the very old Barton Distilling Company, and they now distill 1792, and that's their premier brand. And I kept looking at it, and I thought, this place is a veritable city of warehouses. It's just everywhere. You cannot believe how big this business is until you drive through and see a distillery like that. Same with Heaven Hill, and same with Jim Beam, which are also there. Just enormous complexes where you have the distillery in the center and then all these buildings that are 4 and 5 stories tall all around that are just warehouses where those barrels are aging.
Yeah.
And it's just a stunning thing to see, really.
Oh, it's awesome. I mean, I'll tell you, watching your documentary and doing a little bit of more research myself. I was telling my wife, I'm like, we got to take a trip to Kentucky, and she's like,
you do?
she's like, Kentucky? Why Kentucky? I'm like, it's such a beautiful place. I'm like, you look at it, I'm like, just the landscape, the water, the distilleries. I'm like,
it makes you want to sit down and have a bourbon.
It does, yeah. And I love places like that. My parents have a big backyard with woods, and they have they're farmers, so they stay to have animals back there, goats and chickens and rabbits and stuff. And I remember when I still lived at home, one of the things I used to love doing was sit in the backyard and have a drink and have a smoke and just sit there and listen to nature, and it was just so relaxing. And when you see places like Kentucky that has like all this beautiful streams and all this stuff, it's just
and it does.
Yeah, I mean,
no, those I didn't have to hunt very far to get those shots.
Oh, I'm sure.
They're all over the place. I mean, that is the way the countryside looks here. It's as beautiful as it can be.
Yeah, I mean, you look at the Kentucky Derby. It's funny because it's like it all makes sense when you're like, oh, it makes sense why Kentucky has this great bourbon and why Kentucky has these great race horses. It does all make sense. So
true. Also it's the horse racing and livestock business here is what it is. Also because of the limestone bed. That limestone provides the grass so many minerals that help the bone structure of an animal, that there's not a thoroughbred fold anywhere in the world that will not be sent here to graze.
Wow.
And it's because of what it does to strengthen the muscle and bone of those animals by just eating the grass here. And there's nothing quite like it in the world. And you can see these early settlers, pioneer coming in here, looking at this land like Boone did, and seeing these springs and tasting those springs and saying, I want to live here.
Yeah.
I can handle this. And indeed, I mean, it has been the backbone of what we are to this day.
Well, the amazing thing is when you do your history and your research, and you realize that alcohol at one point, before they realized they had to boil water and people were getting sick from it. I mean, alcohol was considered safer and better for you than water was, and
it is one reason why they did it. I mean, it's just essential for medicinal purposes. That's all they had, and a person had serious issues, they would try that. And I mean, even to this day, I can remember my own family saying, well, you have a heavy head cold or a sore throat, and they give you whiskey, honey, and lemon juice.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and by the way, it did help.
Yeah, well, I used to say that too. How when I was a little, I used to have sinus thing or a cold, and my dad would tell me that to take a shot of his moonshine he would make. We'd call it aguardiente, and so after he makes his wine, he would use the skin of the grapes to make his moonshine. And it's basically the Portuguese version of grappa, like the Italians make. And and I would always tell people, I'm like, I don't know if it worked, but I'd get a good night's sleep and I'd wake up all right, So it's just, but it's funny how it's just a part of the culture. Same thing with like putting, you hear about putting brandy or whiskey on a baby's gums if they're teething, and it makes you wonder because a lot of the active ingredients on the stuff you get, at the local pharmacy, the active ingredient's alcohol. So you're basically skipping all the other stuff and you're just going right to the alcohol. And so it kind of,
another thing I enjoyed, by the way, in working on that film was finding out why, for instance, they use the word proof to tell you the alcohol content. And it's, 90 proof. And it stunned me, really, after doing some work in it, how that word came about. And again, it's a frontier story where, if a person who wanted to go and buy some whiskey from somebody else here would want to know what the alcohol content of that was, because the less alcohol content, the less valuable it was, and the less useful it was. And you would want to have a whiskey that at least was 50% alcohol. And to find that out, they would ask the proprietor or the distiller for some proof that it is at least that content. And the way you would do it then, and you notice in the film we tried it out. We tried it out a whole lot of times, actually. You would take some gunpowder and put it in a dish, and then pour the whiskey over it. And if it was at least 50% alcohol, that gunpowder would ignite, even though it was virtually submerged in the alcohol. And of course, the more quickly it ignited and the bigger poof it had, indicated to the buyer that this has way more than 50%. So early on in the that term is a frontier term. The only way it comes out is proof by gunpowder, and it was the only way they knew how to tell that this had at least 50%, because the charge would remain in that gunpowder even though it was submerged, if it had that much alcohol. So if you notice in the film, we tinkered with it, and it did ignite, because we had a darn good whiskey we were pouring on top of it.
Yeah.
But it's a great tale. The whole thing is a frontier story.
Well, that's the most interesting thing about the whole documentary, is that there's a reason for it, and that's what I love about history, is that there's so many things that we just accept. Okay, this is what they call this. This is what this is the way we do things. But then when you look at the history of it and why it's called a certain thing, why is bourbon called bourbon? Why is it called proof? And then it all starts making sense. It's like, this thing that I kind of took for granted that, just was named this and there's no story behind it. It actually has a story behind it. And
it does.
So
it does. And all things do. All things do. They all have a story.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that is the glory of studying history. I have all my life, and this is one of 9 films we've made for public television, but it's been it was truly one of the most fun ones to put together.
Yeah, and the barrels, for example, I had a question.
Oh yeah.
And the barrels. So I guess it's not confirmed, but some people think that Elijah Craig was the first one to char the barrels to clean it, and then that kind of started using the new charred barrels for bourbon.
Yeah, I kind of debunked that. I know the distillers of Elijah Craig whiskey don't like me for that, but using barrels that are not charred would be harmful, frankly. Because of all the sap. And what you want to do is you want to get rid of the sap blisters in those oak barrels. And so you char them. And it's just routine. And a lot of the barrels they're using on the frontier are barrels that were used elsewhere for something else. And you char them to clean out all the impurities so that, other things don't get mixed up in your solution. So charring the barrel was just done. I mean, there was no one who was responsible for it. It had been done in Europe for centuries before, and it was done here. And there's no one who is responsible for that. It's the way it always was. But one thing about the charring is that it does give the bourbon the amber color, where it likely would not have that color without the charred barrel. But it's interesting. Bourbon was never marketed ever because it had this color and that had another. They all have an amber color, but they're not marketed for that. Never were. It's just a product of the aging in the barrels, but they're marketed by their proof.
Yeah,
Yeah, and how smooth they are, how tasty they are, And
that was one thing you talked about in the documentary, how you didn't see any evidence that the color really made made it more desirable or less desirable. No. Yeah. And,
in other words, in all those ads we went through at the Western Citizen newspaper and in the Kentucky Gazette, we never saw a reference to the color. Ever.
Yeah. Well, they appreciate the taste and the color. I guess the color, they probably know the color can be deceiving. And I've seen it where I bought a really nice, look like pancake syrup, bourbon, and then didn't like it quite as much as, something that was a little darker or something that was, the charcoal, so the barrels, and then there's different types of charring, right? Because there's like, they're not all charred the same way, right? They're not all burned the same way, so that can affect the flavor and color also.
It can. Although today, I mean, the system that you see in the film of the cooperage, that's the cooperage that we filmed that Stitzel and Weller and most of the big Louisville-based distilling companies, that's the cooperage they use for Woodford Reserve and Old Fitzgerald and all the rest of those. That is pretty much standard, where you see the barrel come by and suddenly the flame bursts into that for a short period of time, just enough to char it. And then it's off, and then the next barrel comes in, and the flame goes up. And it wasn't too different in the 19th and 18th century. You never wanted to have that barrel just burned up. You just want to put a char on it, and but then there was no standard for it. You did as best you could, but you had to do it no matter what. You could not get a new barrel made of oak and put whiskey in it or your mix in there and expect it to come out right, because the sap would ruin it.
Yeah.
So you had to char it. And if you got a used barrel, you had to char it because you didn't want any of the impurities in there.
Exactly. So something like, one of my favorite bourbons is Angel's Envy, and it's starting it's starting to become more popular, this idea of aging whiskey in different types of barrels, rum barrels, and all this stuff. And one thing people might not know is that most of these bourbon barrels go to Europe, and that's where they age Scotch in.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, when I was filming I filmed a lot at the Woodford Reserve Distillery. I like it a lot, and the manager there became a close friend and worked with me a lot in that story. But while I was there, he was actually meeting with all the representatives from a Scottish distilling company that was buying all their barrels.
Wow.
And shipping them to Scotland. And now first thing they do is, once they got to Scotland, they'd char them again, of course.
Yeah. So, but
burn it out. Yeah.
So, for example, like Angel's Envy, it has to be in an oak charred barrel for what, a minimum of is there a minimum? And then if so, what do? Do they first put it in a oak charred barrel, then they put it in a port wine barrel for some time?
You mean Angel's Envy?
Yeah, like so brands like that where it's bourbon, but it's aged in some other type of barrel.
Other type of barrel.
Because Angel's Envy, they have their version that's aged in port wine barrels, but it's called bourbon. So do they? So what I'm asking is, do they age it in a oak charred barrel like all bourbon, then they put it in a port wine barrel and age it some more in that, or how do they?
Very likely. I'm not really familiar with their process, frankly. But that sounds like what they're doing, to add yet another flavor to it. And I would imagine they probably didn't, char the second barrel. I mean, they would want to use whatever that gave the whiskey. But it shows you how different all of them are. I mean, they're all different. They all have a different recipe.
But to be bourbon, it can't just be aged in the port wine barrel, right? It has to be in the new.
It has to be in the oak barrel, right?
First.
Now
Okay.
there are some they're aging now in maple barrels. I took a sip of some of that once, and I'll tell you, it gave me such a headache. I couldn't. I don't know what happened.
Really?
Maybe it was just a bad day, a sinus problem. But I don't know if I like that. To me, it has to be in an oak barrel.
So legally, can it be in a maple barrel and still be called bourbon?
Yeah, it can. It can, and it's where it's distilled and where it's aged. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in a oak barrel or whatever. It's where it happens makes it bourbon.
Okay, yeah. So yeah, that's interesting. So what's your opinion on some of the premium bourbons, like the Bakers and stuff like that? Do you are you a fan of those, or what do you drink on a daily basis? You have
I like Woodford the best. Frankly, I became great friends with them, and I'll give you an interesting story about the beginning of this film. Kentucky Educational Television asked me to do a film on bourbon, and I agreed to do it. They underwrote some of it, and my initial venture into this was to call up or visit with some distillers and try to develop a story out of all these current distilling companies. And I found quickly that they all literally are at war with one another. Most of them are owned by entities that are not even American. They're European, English, Japanese, whatever. But these distillers and master distillers and owners of some of these distilling companies, if they found you were going to shoot at Woodford Reserve, they wouldn't want to talk to you.
Really?
It is just a cutthroat business, and they don't want anybody getting any notoriety. And I finally turned to the program director at KET and said, I don't want to do it that way. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a film on the frontier history of whiskey, and it's going to shut down when, probably in the 1820s. That's as far as I'm going to probably go. And because I just want to find out how this all started. And that's the genesis. I tried to do something with all these modern guys, but the competition was so ferocious that I really couldn't film anywhere without feeling the heat from all the rest.
Really? Wow.
So, oh yeah. And so it made it wonderful for me to go to Woodford and shoot a lot of scenes, because that thing was founded in 1812, and that distilling company that's there, LeBrow and Graham Distilling Company, which is where Woodford is distilled now and aged. But that enabled me to go there and film, because that's an old looking distillery where you've got stone buildings, and you can see all the barrels rolling outside down these tracks to be stored, and it's really kind of a cool place. But that's where I wanted to film it. But I knew if I had done anything different and incorporated way more of all the modern stuff in it, I would have suffered some real heat, just real heat, because they just don't like that.
Yeah, well, you figure there's so much money in it that now it's
huge.
Yeah, where it's very cutthroat. But the interesting thing is that some of these brands, like Maker's Mark, what kind of has a look like it's a very old company, it really isn't one of the older companies, And
no, it's not. No,
yeah.
It's not.
So
no, it's not.
That was interesting to me too, just finding that out, that they weren't, because the way the bottle's shaped and the label and the wax, it's like, oh, these guys must have been doing this for centuries, and come to find out that's the look that they're putting out, but it's not.
It's just the look they're putting out. Yeah.
It's funny. Whiskey's one of those, or bourbon's one of those things where it because of the history behind it. Now, when I started looking at bourbon bottles, I started looking at the one that looks the oldest, or the label that looks the old. It's like, but it's not like other alcohols where a vodka or something, you're trying to find the more modern looking bottle that looks sexy and whatnot. But with bourbon, it's like, you know, some of these older looking labels, you're like, oh, you know, if this was some other type of alcohol, you think it's cheap looking because it's cheap, but not with bourbon. It's only it looks old because a lot of these labels and designs were from, you know, a long time ago.
That's right. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, that's and then I remember you getting into the Revolutionary War and the whiskey tax, and you know how before that. That's,
I know friends here in Kentucky who are direct descendants of distillers who ran out of Pennsylvania because in the Whiskey Rebellion, and came here to Kentucky. And they came here because we had a federal judge, Harry Innes, whose descendants are also still here, who I know, who was presented complaints by the United States Attorney, by the head of federal revenue here, which was Chief Justice John Marshall's father, and then his brother Thomas Marshall, where they were trying to collect the whiskey tax against all these distillers. There are like 180 of them. And Harry Innes was a huge buyer of whiskey. And in fact, Elijah Craig was one of his chief sources of his whiskey. And Harry, what he did in that case, even though every one of them owed the money, there's no question about it, this is the tax, this is how much they owed on what they made, he cut the judgments in half, and then gave these distillers these liberal terms for paying it back. And so a lot of these Pennsylvanians thought, well, hell, this guy's going to kind of protect us. And so they began coming here. And that's what swelled the ranks of distillers, is after the whiskey tax in 1791 and the rebellion over it. A lot of those Pennsylvanians, where the rebellion was at its height, left western Pennsylvania and came to Kentucky because they felt they could get protected.
Yeah, and it's interesting, like you said earlier in the show, how whiskey was used as a currency, and then once the whiskey tax came about, a lot of these people couldn't use, obviously, whiskey as a currency, you know, right. So it caused a uproar, and but that's really interesting. It's funny how the state does that. You know, it's like people don't have the flexibility to kind of trade in ways they were trading, and it kind of forces you to have to be a part of their system, you know, and that was really interesting. But yeah, I mean,
and old George Washington was a distiller himself, and in fact, his distillery is now functional at Mount Vernon.
Wow,
they've got it running again.
That was the cool thing. Like when you were at the Woodford Reserve, it was amazing that you said, like, it's basically been unchanged. It still looks the same, and it's still, so it's cool. You know, it's funny because I talk to people sometimes about going on vacations, and you know, they talk about leaving the States and going, you know, and and same thing, like I when I was younger, I'd always used to go to Portugal. Every vacation it was always like we'd go to Portugal. And then as you get older and you start learning some of the history in America, it's like, wow, man, we live in a country that has tons of its own history, and we keep leaving it to go see history somewhere else. But there's a lot of unique and interesting history just here, and beautiful places in this country that we haven't seen yet.
Oh yeah, I've often been amazed that people they want to tell you about all their travels overseas, but they don't seem to know much of anything. I mean, and I keep asking, well, why don't you travel around? Well, you know, we can always see this. I said, no, you know, you don't know anything about this. Why don't you, look and see and learn something here? I mean, there's so much in this country that is of, to me, of just immense interest. And but for anyone who wants to come to Kentucky and see the distilling industry here, it is wide open for you to see. I mean, and it's awe-inspiring to look at. It's huge, just the size of these distilleries.
So is it similar to Napa Valley, where you could go down one road and stop by a couple of distilleries? And,
Oh yeah. In certain towns like Bardstown, outside of Frankfurt, Louisville. There are places. Bardstown is probably the best known because of the sheer number of distilleries there. You can just drive along and go from one to the next. They're all kind of have the same look. They're all a little bit different, and they all encourage visitors. And they have, gift shops, museums at every site. It's rather remarkable.
Now, as bourbon becomes more popular, is there ever a concern? Because it seems like with a lot of different things that as it becomes more popular, the quality sometimes diminishes a little bit. Is there a concern about that? Like these big international companies, like you were talking about, buying some of these companies and not really caring about the history of it and the way it was made and the quality quite as much?
I don't know. I'll tell you, the competition is so ferocious that if someone slacked off and his product ceased to be something, there'd be people jumping in the middle and making up for it. There are bourbons, there are whiskey distilleries popping up all the time. New ones, small batch ones, which are the best. And like Woodford is. So there's always going to be ample amount of this product that's going to be of high order. And because there will always be a demand for it.
Yeah, well,
so I don't see that happening. I think anyone who slacked off would do it at his peril.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, it's like you said, it's so popular that if your product starts, not being quite as good, people are going to go. There's plenty of other options. People will go somewhere else.
There are plenty of options. Yeah. Go to a liquor store and just take a look.
Absolutely. But thank you so much, Ken. I really appreciate your time. This was
my pleasure.
Awesome conversation. Like I said, I learned so much from your documentary. And whiskey is one of those things that I've always been intrigued with. But just finding specifically Kentucky, just the history there in bourbon, and a lot of documentaries just kind of show you the process of fermentation and all that stuff. But going into the history of it and all the interesting just aspects.
It's wonderful. It makes you love it. It makes you love it even more, really.
So is this just a hobby of yours to do? Because I know you're part of the Witnessing History company.
Yeah, I formed that company. It's a film production company, and I've long ago ceased to regard history as a hobby. It is really part of what I do every day. I've practiced law for 43 years. In Kentucky and in Washington and D.C. But history has always been my great love, and I write a lot of history, mostly Civil War history. And I have 6 books out and working on another one now. They're all Civil War titles. But then because I often give tours, and I'm doing one this week, of battlefields and campaigns. Someone asked me once, a film company here locally, a video company, asked me, he says, have you ever thought of just making a film about it? And then you don't have to go out and do all that work. And so I said, no, not seriously, but what if I did? I mean, would you be interested? And they said, yeah. And so we made a film, a 90-minute film on the Civil War in Kentucky. It's really on the invasion of Kentucky in 1862. And that film it came out in 2007, and it has been broadcast continuously, like Bourbon has, by Kentucky Educational Television and other outlets all around the world. And that's what got me into doing that. The difficulty in filmmaking, of course, is that it takes a great deal of capital. And so for every film you make, you've got to raise the capital. And these are not cheap to make. And it takes a lot of man-hours and a lot of different moving parts. We did a film a couple of years ago, came out in 2014, on the life of Daniel Boone. He's a great favorite of mine. And, of course, he was sheriff of this county. But that film entailed us having to film scenes with more than 150 actors and actresses. We had to film it in Southwest Virginia and in Tennessee and in Kentucky, Missouri, Pennsylvania, Virginia. I mean, it was just an immense ordeal to do that. But it's a 2-hour film, and it has been just gotten rave reviews. And you know, in filming a thing like that, like with Bourbon, we did a film on the Lincoln family in Kentucky. That's the last one we came out with, which just covers their 34 years in this state. And they're great fun to do. They are, again, they require orchestrating just all kinds of moving parts. And so, unlike writing a book, you have to come up with the capital for these and to make that work. And but I enjoy it, and we're in the midst of working on this hemp film, and I think it's going to have every aspect of being just like the Bourbon one.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you know the history with William Randolph Hearst and hemp, and you know his hand in making it illegal, making marijuana illegal?
Well, not in any great detail. No, I don't. I mean, I know of his name in its connection with the hemp deal, but those are things that once we get into the film, we'll certainly be uncovering, because I like to do my homework.
Yeah, it's interesting, but yeah, like you talked about, history is a part. I tell people all the time, I'm like, you don't realize it, but you like history, and they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, if you're into cars and you like old cars, then you like the history of the automobile. If you like basketball and you like old players, you like hearing about the Bill Russell and Red Auerbach and the Celtics, then you like the history of basketball. So it's this idea. Some people think history is only political or military history, but appreciating anything that happened before now is enjoying history. And you have a better understanding of today when you understand what happened yesterday.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, because again, everything has a story. Everything on Earth has a story, and nothing just happens, just suddenly popped out. It took a long time. And it's fun to figure out how it all started. And Bourbon became particularly interesting to me. Really did.
So people can find your film. I saw it on Amazon Prime. You said it's available.
We sell the DVDs here. It's witnessinghistoryonline.com.
Yeah.
And you can then go to the shop page, and there it is.
And are your books?
We fill orders every day.
Are your books also available there, or are they
My
available?
books are available. Yes, they are, and everything I do is on that shop page. Okay. And we have all the films except The Invasion of Kentucky, which was basically owned. We made it for someone who was the financier of it. All the films except for that one, you can buy on the shop page. All the Daniel Boone, the Lincoln, the Horse in the Civil War. Bourbon, Henry Clay and the struggle for the Union. A lot of Kentucky themes, but there are also themes that are big national themes as well, but they just happen to be played out by some Kentuckians.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ken. I really appreciate your time. It was an awesome conversation.
Pleasure.
I'll definitely keep a lookout for your work. Once the show's up, I'll put links to all your work and your website.
Wonderful. Thank you.
On the show, and I'll once the show's up and live, I'll send it to you, and feel free to
send it to me.
Yeah. Feel free to post it, and it's all open source. So this is kind of like making documentaries. It's not the greatest investment. You do it out of
That's okay.
You do it out of I do this out of passion and just love of spreading this information. So
let's stay in touch.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to have you on to talk about some other books.
Call me anytime.
Yeah, great.
Call me anytime.
Well, thank you so much, Ken. I really appreciate your time. I know you're a busy man, especially with writing and then family, and we're getting close to your drink at 2 in the afternoon.
Well, I still got a little ways to go. I have mine around 5 or 6. So.
But thank you so much. And if I ever convince the wife to go to Kentucky, I'll definitely get in contact with you. I'd love.
Call me. I'll show you some sites.
Oh, that'd be great. Well,
okay.
Hey, enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Same to you.
Take care.
Bye-bye now.
Yep, bye.
Believe in the ripple effect.